Hey, just thought I'd share a couple of spooky stories from my childhood to get everyone all hyped for Halloween. When I was a child, it was just me and my mother. We lived in a property owned by my grandma, a three-story old farmhouse right at the fringe of the woods. It was far off the road, down a long, unlit gravel driveway. It felt very isolated at night, being so distant from other houses, set in the area that hadn't been inhabited for 30 years before we started living in it. Quite often, I was fairly a rambunctious child, so while my mom went off to work, I would occasionally skip the morning bus to school to stay home and be alone all day. The big house had a habit of feeling incredibly lonely and sparse, so I spent most of my time playing in the forest expanse out back, some distance into the woods, far enough that I couldn't hear my mother when she called. There was also a toppled pine tree that had crashed into another. An even larger trunk on its way down was frozen there, forming a large arc over the forest door. I loved to climb the jagged stump at the base of the fallen tree and steady myself to a point where I was just above the middle. I was never able to make it all the way up to the top because it got too steep for me to continue any further, and I had a bad habit of freaking out of how high up I was. One day I was sitting in my usual spot on the falling tree, which was a good distance from the ground, just listening to the birds singing and simultaneously feeling the warmth of the sun on my neck, when I heard something strange from underneath that paralyzed me shock. "Hey kid." I was gripped by a sudden strong urge of fear for the moment. The voice came from directly underneath me. I strained to look down, but I couldn't see anything over the ledge. For a long time I just sat there, in absolute silence, and I was at the point where I was almost soon to convince myself that I had imagined hearing a man's voice at all. "I know you can hear me." His voice was much louder this time. As I yelled something out, I scrambled up to the log a bit higher, trembling nervously. I dug my fingernails into the bark and held tight to my dear life. As I sat there, trying to collect my nerves for God knows how long, although I couldn't see it, the presence of that thing underneath me was still clear. The bird song was much softer and more cautious this time, and when I listened closely, I swear I could hear the faintest echo of human breathing. Gathering all my courage, I vowed to prove myself that it was all just my imagination, by leaning over to the edge as far as I possibly could without slipping right off, digging hard into the bark behind me. I stretched out as long as my arms peered over, getting a full view of the empty forest floor and undergrowth, when suddenly, "Come down here, or I'll come up and grab you." It was so loud, as if it was being screamed right in my face. I released my grip on the tree in fright and plunged off the platform. I was only saved by grabbing a nearby branch, and for an awful 1 second, my bare legs dangled onto the cool air. When I pulled myself up, I ran at full speed at the top of the collapsed pine to the point where I never reached before. I just sat there, just below the rustling canopy, pissing myself and staring at the distant base where the splinter wood rose, fully expecting it at any moment to see someone crawling rapidly up the pine towards me. Instead, all I heard was the wind whistling in the leaves above me and below me, and occasionally snippets of birdsong. But it was about 2 hours before my mother got home and found me, after much worried searching, trembling, and crying at the top of the fallen tree. Although this incident spooked me and my mother, in time I somehow recovered, exhibiting that I have hard skin of a child, although I never went as far as the forest as I used to, and never again even approached that fallen tree. Once I was 12, I had the chore of taking the firewood from the shed out back, just the edge of the woods, and bringing it back inside the house. It was a tiresome job, and I always chose to do it when dusk and the air was brimming with mosquitoes and swampy fog that usually coated the lawn. But by the time I had made my last round, I would sprint back to the house spooked. One of my least favorite things to do about this job was the shed was full of barn owls, If you've ever seen a barn owl's face staring at you from a dark roof corner, then you'll know how uncomfortable that shed made me. One of these nights, it got mistier than it was before. A thick silver fog covered everything and limited my line of sight in a short spear around me. Even though the shed wasn't far from my house, I found myself feeling disoriented, and more than once I had walked in the wrong direction, both times for some reason, walking straight into the woods. By the time I recently reached my last load, it was too foggy down to see the street. My eyes stunned in the most moisture and made my vision blur. Lurching forward, I managed to walk headfirst into a tree, doubling over and dropping all the wood I was bundling into my feet with a hard crunch. As I went to pick them up, my foot throbbing pretty hard, when I realized the ground was too misty for me to see my own knees. I decided to head to the house since we had more than enough wood for one night. However, it was going to get pretty dark. Soon, and I couldn't make out any significance of which direction I was heading in. Even though I cautiously walked for several feet in direction, trying to figure out my position of the mists, I could still figure it out any point of identification. I couldn't even locate the fence or front gate. The more I walked, the more I seemed to stumble into trees, pine needles and mud crunching under my feet instead of dew-covered lawn. After a while, I finally realized I couldn't even find my own shed anymore. Cursing myself for being so dumb, while trying to ignore my thumping heart and sense that something else was at play, I became aware that I was lost somewhere into the fringe of the forest. Screaming out for my mother at the loudest possible volume was only met with resounding silence from the depths of the mist around where I stood, affirming that I was wandered off too far from the house to be heard. As a deep panic started to settle on me, I noticed a glimpse of something pink moving against the nearby pine trunk. Coming closer, I saw that it was ripped out of my square of pink paper. Oh, and there was an arrow pointing left. In fact, it looks as if something my mom made. I rationalized, kept me from getting lost, so foolishly I followed the direction set by that green arrow, shivering in the increasing cold. I kept walking for about 5 to 10 minutes, before needing to stop to catch my breath. My heart was pounding so fast it was beginning to hurt. As I was sitting down, however, I spied what appeared to be a fervent note fluttering on a nearby trunk. I noticed how this one was embedded with a long nail, before another arrow, this one pointing up. A small, sloppily written note said, "This way." Despite my increasing panic, I convinced myself that these notes were my only shot to get back before nightfall. I was desperate to get the hell out of my brow was cold with sweat, so I followed the green arrow to the point where I could dimly just make out another spot of pink, an incline of collapsed stumps and leaf litter. At this point, it was getting pretty dark, and I had to strain both my eyes just to see a few meters ahead of me. Following the green arrows, feeling less and less sure of where I was, I stumbled through the woods, groping out of the mists and feel for the trees, although I was terrified of something unseen grabbing my arm. I came across the third green note, which had another arrow pointing up again, this one leading to an increasingly steep slope that I didn't recognize being anywhere near my house, and a poorly drawn smiley face right above it. At this stage, I became too freaked out to cope and started to cry a little. As I slumped against a pine stump, the possibility that I would be out of these woods all night was beginning to sink in, and like a syringe being driven into the veins of my arm, I caught a glimpse of another pink square in the near distance. Squinting hard, unnerved by these notes, all which looked fresh and without any sign of decay, despite the previous week's non-stop rain. I read it from afar. What I read made my blood turn cold. I stood to my knees, dead silently, wobbling them in fear. My ears were sensitive to any prickle noise of the mist. For a long time, I stood there rolling in the fog, reading and rereading that horrible note over and over again, before a snapping stick somewhere behind me caused me to sprint, blindly twigs snagging at my ankles and cutting up in my face as I ran. Written on the note in big green letters was my name. I felt like I was running for hours. All the while, the rain and the mist lapped at the back of my neck, and like the decaying breath of someone running right behind me. Somehow I made it back to the house. All the lights were off, and I struggled to find the keys for my moment. When I found them, I bolted indoors and quickly crawled into bed somewhere where I remained, unsleeping till morning. My mom just thought I'd come inside and gone to bed, and hadn't thought about it to leave the lights on. It was a miracle, aka some freakish coincidence, that even if I found the house at all, the final incident at that damn house was witnessed only by my mother, up until she never experienced any of these strange feelings I had. Although we mutually shared the particular oppressive quality that the house's interior had on us, and this placement in this dreary, imposing woods. Although I was more obvious, never a popular kid, by living away out in the country in the opposite direction from everyone else in my school. I did make some tight friends in my first year of high school. One of these friends, Amanda was her name, invited me over one night and I accepted it. My mother drove me out of the place, which was about 3 miles away. Drove back home. The night went well as we watched a horror movie, devoured some pizza, and probably smoked a little pot. My mother went home alone, where she intended to get some writing done. She worked for a magazine at that point, and it was about midnight when I received the putting off text from my mom in all caps. "Is this a prank? I need to know immediately." Thinking it was some joke, I texted back, "Calm yourself. What is a prank?" Almost immediately the response, "Are you at the house?" Of course I responded no, though I was thoroughly weirded out. I didn't receive another message until around 3 a.m., when she told me to go to my grandma's in the morning and do not by any means dare to go home. I remember those bleak torrents of the rain that day I went to my grandmother's, and how terribly soaked I was. When I finally got there, it was nearly 2 towns away, and I thought I had the temptation to go home and drop off my bags. But my mom's disturbing messages from last night were enough of the warning to not do so. When I arrived, my mom and grandma were having lunch. At first my mother seemed to be in some sort of composed state, but when I got a better look at her, I noticed that all of the color had drained from her face, and she was slightly trembling. At one point, she even got a small glass crash into the floor after flinching at the cap bursting around her ankles. It wasn't until later that night, when my grandma was sound asleep, she told me what happened. She went further as to forbid me from telling old grandma, out of fear that would horrify her superstitious souls too much. This is what happened at the night when I was at Amanda's. She described as the lurid detail. My mother was sitting on the first story in the living room, where she sat on the couch by the fire, curtains open to the view of the sunset of the canopy, going over the latest draft. At first it was so faint that she could barely notice it, but after a while, my mother became more aware of and vaguely irritated by tiny thumping noises near her head at the window. When she went over to investigate, she saw fat brown moths that were kind of often we got at the place buzzing madly onto the glass. Reasoning that it was the cause of the sound, she returned to her work. However, the feeling of being ratted in some way, it was when the noises started to get sharper and louder. She paid more attention and saw that the rocks were being thrown at the window from the total blackness of the forest edge. She then saw them appear from the shadows of the bush and then fell into the arc and bounced off the window. Looking carefully, as she could see small cracks were heavy ones that had hit, right beside her where her head had been moments before. Temporarily captivated, she tried to peer out into the darkness enough to make out where the rocks were being thrown from. Then, startled with shock, she jumped back from the window, and she saw me standing half behind a tree near the window, grinning wide and staring at her. My one visible eye stretched wide open, showing all white. She barely stiffed into a scream, seeing her own daughter standing there, just staring and smiling. Not only did it figure out it did not move or blink, it was standing near one of the nearest pine trees, far from where the rocks were shooting up out of the bush. As it continued to do so, a loud downpour, my face unseasoning, continued to press out to her, smiling. Thinking this was all some sort of sick prank. Hence later, my mother shouted my name at the top of her lungs, frightened to the core. However, instead of responding, the mouth of that thing that looked like me, behind me, just started moving, as if it were mouthing silent words really, really fast. Suddenly it turned its head to the side, seems to be talking to someone else behind me. My mom said that who couldn't be seen, but she said the form is a black-shaped figure hanging against the other side of my bed of the tree. That girl that looked like me kept staring at my mother and doing the silent speed talking thing, and then turning and whispering the thing next to her. Then she would turn back and start up again, then breaking the monstrous spell. She eventually pointed straight at my mother and started laughing. My mother screamed and fled to my bedroom on the second story, the only room with a working lock, where she shut herself in and sat in the far end of the bed as she rocks began to pitter-patter against the window downstairs, dry heaving and weeping in fear. In my room, my mom said that she did not feel safe. There was an awful smell and weird humming noises in the walls that she described. She tried to pray for a time being before giving up and just listening to the rocks pellet the walls and windows. Somewhere in the kitchen she caught a distant, vibrant sound of a window actually smashing, and the weird, continuous humming. Listening more carefully, she could identify the softest hint of mumbling noise. In absolute horror, she recognized the voice and then, virtually too afraid to look, she tilted her head up close to the closet window, where an awful white face could be seen staring back at her, mouth contorting into a gaping and what seems to be like highly sped up whispering. The closet door was only a meter away from my mother. It started to open slowly. An unimaginable explosion of terror. She immediately bolted to the door, only to fumble the lock as the bigger and bigger rocks came crashing through the window, which burst in a part of spray glass shards before finally getting out. Running out of the house, completely keeping her eyes off the woods, getting into her car and driving off, she said as she glanced back, and at the end of the prolonged drive, she saw two unmistakable human forms standing at the broken window, watching her car got further and further away from her house. This would be the final farewell, as my mother never stepped foot in that place again. As my mother told this story, she broke down into tears. I didn't doubt her, and I still don't. Honestly, I fully believed in what she experienced the way she says. It was also quite clear that we were done living in that house for once and for all. I only went back once with my dad, who I see very rarely now. He came from another state to help us move. My mom already found a place in town and moved in. My dad and I just loaded up his truck with all the place what was left in it. It was silent, sunny morning when we moved all the stuff, emptied the place. I wish I could say there was some closure, some final spookings cap it all, but there wasn't. There was just a relief to be out there. However, only two things worth mentioning. One, when we checked the house for any sign of intruders, we found that several windows, including one in my bedroom and kitchen, had been smashed and the rocks were lying on the floor. 2, Dad went out to the trees for a bit to take a leak. When he came back, he asked how long we had been set the swing for. Needless to say, we never had a swing set, so I was fairly unsettled to discover that a week has gone and no one has assembled that rope swing from the highest branches of the old pine tree of the ridge against what's fallen log I stopped climbing many years ago. I obviously new rope, new, nicely polished, sanded down wooden seat at the base. Dad wanted to keep my mind from recent events. He doubted the affair and thought that my mother was mentally unstable. Said that a neighbor probably set it up, not realizing it was on our property. Of course, he knew as well that I did not, and literally had no neighbors for at least a mile in our direction. There were no houses in that space, and never had any time living there, so I did not ever see signs of human habitation. But I let it all go, as we pleased enough to say good riddance to that horrible place as we drove off for good. For the most part, I have found it my best to try and forget what happened in that place. Sometimes I just can't help but ponder it, even though it's been enough long now, and that I no longer feel scared talking about it. But for a while I couldn't. Seeing as it was Halloween, what a better time to share. My grandma just recently sold the house to a new family, that being a young couple and their little son. Shortly after we moved out, despite my mother's desperate insistence that it be left empty. She now refused to talk about what happened altogether. I'm less anxious about it, although sometimes I can't help but let my imagination get the better of me. All I can really do is think of that old house, the fallen tree, and the new occupants, and that swing out back, gently spinning in the breeze as that little boy toddles obviously towards it. Well, that was Out in the Woods. This story was obviously a really good, well-made, fall Halloween related, creepypasta. Now, I honestly heard of this story from Mr. Creepypasta, I believe last year or something, but I hadn't had time to read this story, but now that I finally had the opportunity to do it, I am going to say right now that this was actually a really awesome creepypasta. Like, this story was written by Prozac101. I actually found out from looking at the description of Nature's Temper's description. Nature's Temper read this story as well as Mr. Creepypasta. So this is honestly a really well-made story. But I do know for a fact, Creepy Ghost Stories also did this story as well. But I know there's a few, I believe there might have been a few other narrators that actually narrated this one. So I'm definitely going to say it's a great creepypasta. I honestly really like the fact that this story does have a good concept. Like, the protagonist of this story honestly did have really good emotions and showed that, they were terrified of, what this thing really is and what it was doing. About that thing that the protagonist's mother kept seeing, I have a feeling it was pretty much maybe a skinwalker, making these sounds or all that, or maybe it was just evil spirits or paranormal. I mean, it's obvious that this story gives us like a bunch of ideas of what could have possibly, whatever this creature was, started to go after, what was going on. So it honestly really makes a lot more sense. But I honestly really gotta say it's well written in detail. I mean, I actually remember seeing this story, last year. Yeah, I already mentioned, but yeah, I do repeat myself. So yeah, I do pardon about that because, that's a trait in me that's always been hard for me to do, is not repeat myself a couple times, but I'm getting somewhat a little better with it. So yeah, I've been working on it and I'm not perfect, but definitely have to say it's a really well-made creepypasta. Even though it had really good concepts, it did have really good intention of making something good. So I definitely have to say it's a really awesome, well-made creepypasta. Yeah, I definitely have to say, I mean, I really wish there could have been a little bit more explanation on, why these things were going after them. Like, were they, past people that lived there but in that house before they died? Did something happen to them in that house and their spirit is, like, haunting the place or something? I mean, it honestly really gives me, a little bit of kind of like a good question as to what exactly happened. I mean, I'm honestly really confused, but I also really wanted to know what actually really got these creatures or whatever to go after the protagonist her um and her mother in particular. Now, obviously, I'm guessing it might have been just some paranormal, spiritual stuff, or it could have been a skinwalker. But like I said, we're not really sure, and the great unknown is pretty much just maybe something that is probably the answer. But like I said, I really don't know, and I can't really answer. But I really have to say, if the author of this story manages to find this story, not this story, but manages to find this video, he or she, they, them, could maybe comment and let us know. But I really gotta say to the author, awesome story. Like, to this author, you did an awesome job with this story. I'm not gonna lie. This one was fun to read. It was good, yes, unnerving, but it was also an awesome story. So I gotta really say, you did really awesome putting time and effort into this story. Because this story was just flat out amazing. Especially for Halloween. Not really for Halloween, but it's more of a fall story, but it's still a pretty good one. I honestly gotta say that I actually enjoy narrating this. This was actually a lot of fun. I really liked this one. And I really hope to, read more of your stories, author, if you happen to have more stories around. But anyways, with that being said, I guess I'm going to wrap up this review because there's nothing really much I can say because, oh yeah, I want to definitely say, for those of you who are wondering, the way the story is written is really awesome. Like, the paragraph structuring is amazing. Sentence structuring is really well made, and the grammar is really good. Definitely gotta say, it was all readable. It was amazing. I had fun reading this story. I thought this was cool, and I recommend you guys, take a look at this story if you haven't. It's on the regular Creepypasta Wiki, so you guys feel free to go check it out. I want you to go check out Nature's Temper's narration as well as Mr. Creepypasta if you haven't. So anyways, I guess with that being the case, that being said, like I'm going to say, this is just simply my own personal opinion, and if you happen to disagree with me, that's perfectly fine too. We're all entitled to our own opinions regards to these creepypastas. This is just simply my own personal thoughts. My final rating of this story is definitely a 10 out of 10. I love this story. I honestly do hope that we get more of these stories in the future. But like I said, I can't really guarantee it. But, I mean, it depends if we find any good ones. But I know I do have some more coming in the way. So that's honestly going to be really something. So anyways, what did you guys personally think of this creepypasta? Did you all enjoy it? Did you all not? And also, what would you have done personally to help make this story a lot better? Feel free to leave me know what your thoughts are down in the comments below. I'm the Lion Queen. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. And if you're brand new here to this channel, feel free to leave a like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell for notifications to when I upload, so that way you guys will not miss an upload. And as always, please roll the outro because I'm out.